Hello everyone. This lecture series is brought to you as a courtesy of Raj Malhotra IAS Institute, Chandigarh. In today's lecture, I, Ayush Gupta, will be covering for you an article which was featured in yesterday's Indian Express's Explained section. So this article was titled as How Weakening Growth in Consumer Demand has Impacted GDP Growth. By means of this very lecture, we are going to understand this very concept and the debate around this very subject. So, this article sought to answer the following question. India's growth rate has been held back due to weak consumer demand, or should we blame inadequate supply? So, in order to answer this very question, we are to first see as to what should or what component of economy should we study in order to see the reasons behind the slump in India's economic growth. So, if we are to analyze different sectors in order to appreciate as to the reasons behind the slump in consumer demand, or whether it is from the supply side, then we will arrive at varying answers which might not suit to the entire economy. For example, if we are to analyze automobile sector and answer this very question as to whether it is the low consumer demand or the lack on the supply side that has impacted the slump in automobile sector, we'll come to the conclusion that with respect to automobile sector, there has been slump in consumer demand, which is why many automobile companies have recently shut shop. However, if we are to discuss with respect to box office collections, then we'll come to the conclusion that today the cinema industry is not producing enough movies which could be played on the movie halls, and which is why over here there is a problem from the supply side, because most of the cinema industry, for want of certainty, has today moved to OTT platforms. Therefore, if we are to analyze and answer these questions by seeking answers from different sectors' performance, we might not be able to give an holistic answer. Therefore, it is the GDP that we analyze in order to answer whether as to the reasons behind the slump in economy. So now let us see what does GDP constitutes. So when we talk about GDP, it is calculated by capturing the expenditures of different components of the economy. So different components of the economy aggregate expenditure will tell us the gross domestic product, that is the total amount of goods and services produced in the country. So naturally we are going to spend on things that the country has produced. So in this very manner, we also get to know as to how much production there has been in the economy. So these three factors are private final consumption expenditure. It is the expenditure that you and I, normal people, do in the market. Then gross fixed capital formation. So the expenditure which has been made by the private sector as well as by the government on fixed capital formations, those instruments, those capital which can actually lead to future growth or future production, serve as instruments of future production. So these are investments. And then government final consumption expenditure, the expenditure that government does in order to run its administration and its day-to-day functioning in the manner on petrol, on salaries, and etc. etc. So besides this, we also have the net exports, that is the total amount of exports minus total amount of imports. So when we study these three components of GDP, we get to know that private final consumption expenditure accounts for about 55 to 56% of all the national GDP in a year, and therefore it is the biggest driver of the economy. So GDP के अंदर सबसे ज़्यादा contribution है private final consumption expenditure का, which is roughly between 55 to 60%. Then the second most contribution is by gross fixed capital formation, which somewhere hovers around 35%, and the rest is given by government final consumption expenditure, roughly about 10 to 12%. Now, besides this, there is an intricate relation between private final consumption expenditure and gross fixed capital formation, in a manner that private final consumption expenditure also gives boost to gross fixed capital formation. Why is that so? Because if the market is spending, if people are spending, then naturally the industry will get an incentive to invest further in the market so as to enhance their production capacity and reap benefits from this growing demand. And therefore, it becomes critical to study private final consumption expenditure and what has been its growth over the years. So, let us track this growth by means of this very table, which was given in the Indian Express's explained section. So, as per this table, private final consumption expenditure grew at an annual rate of about, this is the mean rate, 8.2% between 2004 financial year to 2011 financial year. So, you can see over here that from financial year 05 to financial year 2011-12, the mean growth was about 8.2% in private final consumption expenditure. Then, between financial year 2012 to financial year 2020, just before the COVID had struck, this growth shrunk to 6.8% per year. Now, also post demonetization, there was a further slump in private consumption expenditure, and therefore, if we are to break this down again and see what was the mean growth in private consumption expenditure from the financial year 17 to 2020, then we see that it was 6.4%, which is much lower from this very aggregate that we had taken before, that is from financial year 12 to financial year 20. Now, if we are to include in this financial year 2021 also, in which the worst impact of COVID was seen, then we see that the growth slumps down to below 5%, that is around about 4.9%. And now, the government of India is to this time expecting that in financial year, the present financial year, that is financial year 2021-2022, that there will be an annual growth in GDP of 9.5%. Now, if we are to assume that the private financial consumption expenditure will also increase by this very rate only, that is 9.5%, and then calculate the mean growth from financial year 2012 to financial year 2022, then also we come at a rate of 5.4%. And if we are to break this down further and again see from financial year 2017 to financial year 2022, this will come out to be as 3.7% per year. So, you can see how the Indian economy is losing its momentum. The private final consumption expenditure, it has been losing its momentum over the years. Now, why it is so important? The very reason it is so important is that you understand this very thing. How is GDP growth going to be calculated? So, if we say that GDP grows by X%, so this X% will be aggregate of the increase in final consumption, private financial consumption expenditure, plus the increase in gross fixed capital formation, plus the increase in government financial final consumption expenditure. So as we know that the largest part of GDP is private final consumption expenditure, then if it's the growth in this very sector will also constitute and will also be the biggest contributing factor in the aggregate growth in GDP as well. It is for this very reason that private final consumption expenditure and its growth is very important, and likewise its impact on gross fixed capital formation. Because of its impact on gross fixed capital formation also, it is extremely important. So what has been the reason behind this thing? Naturally, as I said, that there is an other implication of this also. If private final consumption expenditure goes down, then naturally gross fixed capital formation will also go down. And as we can see that with respect to gross fixed capital gross fixed capital formation यहाँ पे change होएगा, grew by just 3.9% between financial year 12 to financial year 2020. Whereas if we can see that between financial year 12 and financial year 20, the private financial consumption expenditure grew at the rate of 6.8%. However, gross fixed capital formation was growing at the rate of 3.9% only. And if we are to compare this between from financial year 05 to financial year 11, we see that during that period of time, gross final consumption expenditure was growing, final capital formation was growing at a rate of 10.9%. So we can see how there has been corresponding dip in gross capital formation also. Then now the debate is this dip in private financial consumption expenditure because of inadequate supply? So in this very way, the burden is sought to be put on the industry. They are saying the question is that there is demand in the market. However, since the production is not there, the supply is inadequate, it is for this very reason that this demand does not gets fulfilled, and there is not a rise in private final consumption expenditure. In order to see whether this argument is right or not, whether there is actually inadequate supply in the market due to which private financial consumption expenditure is seeing dip, we need to see as to whether our capacity of production is being used completely or not. In order to analyze this thing, so there is this RBI's data. RBI collects data with respect to order books, inventories and capacity utilization. It conducts a survey with respect to the same, and as per this survey, the capacity utilization is below 75% mark. So basically it is saying that industry की जो capacity utilization है, it is already below 75% mark. So in this very manner, naturally inadequate supply could not be the reason behind the dip in private final consumption expenditure, because if there was a demand in the economy, if people were ready to spend, then naturally the industry, why would the industry leave its production capacity as unused? So as per Udit Mishra ji, who is the associate editor who has written in this very article, he says that in order to correct this thing, there needs to be improvement in private final consumption expenditure, and it needs to be rising sharply, and only then India's GDP growth would rise, otherwise it would fail to achieve its potential. Because only and only when private final consumption expenditure will rise exponentially, sharply, then only, first of all, the industry will first utilize its full capacity, and then will start investing more in gross capital formation. However, when studying this, we also need to see the very fact that private final consumption expenditure has been in decline since 2012 onwards. However, it still remains as the most important driver of the Indian economy's growth. And there was a case study in RBI's annual report of 2017. What did this case study said? This case study said that it was actually titled as, is consumption led expansion sustainable? क्या consumption से ही हमारा जो expansion है, it would be sustainable in the long run, or we need that investment should pick up and investment should be the main driver of our growth? What does this case study says? This case study says that consumption led growth can arguably lead to slackening of future growth if it entails growing imbalances due to limits on capacity creation and rising debt burdens, particularly for households. Let us understand this very statement. So it is saying that if the economy is growing and the major driving factor of growth in economy is private final consumption expenditure, and this is being happening while the scope of investment is been reducing in the economy, that is, there has been imbalance to capacity creation, the balance between gross final capital formation and the private final consumption expenditure is not right. And along with this, the private final consumption expenditure is being raised because of the debt that households have taken. So for example, it is saying that there is an imbalance between the expenditure of the people and the other factor which the expenditure boosts, that is the investment. So if there won't be investment in the economy, naturally people will not be having money, because investment will generate employment. However, employment has not been generated, as we have also seen from past year data with respect to employment, which said that there is a large population in the Indian economy which is unemployed today. So how come private final consumption expenditure is increasing? Because you are not having employment, because your incomes are not rising. Then it says that basically upon analysis it came out that household debt, private household debt had seen a rise. So basically people have been taking loans and spending it. The credit card debt has been increased over the years. So this sort of consumption driven growth will not go for long, and there would be a time which would come, it was said in 2017, when this consumption driven growth would not be able to drive the economy further. Now, though it appears that growth in GFCE was not so low between financial year 12 to financial year 2022 in comparison to growth in private final consumption expenditure, but it has to be noted that the capital formation was largely based on government orders and not private investments. So data can be deceptive, as we've already told you in previous lectures. So upon an analysis, we find that there wasn't much difference between private final growth in private final consumption expenditure and gross fixed capital formation. So someone would say that this argument will not hold of the RBI's report. However, it has been analyzed that gross fixed capital formation and the growth in it was largely because of government orders and not because of private investment. What remains to be answered is now how to revive the economy. So basically, the only solution to this today is that government has to work upon all the three factors, that is private final consumption expenditure. Today the interest rates are at an all-time low, which would basically prompt people to take more loans and spend in the market. Secondly, the government needs to bring in policies which would boost investment by private sector, not the government sector. That is, gross fixed capital formation should come from the private sector. For this, even yesterday only, the finance minister has announced production linked incentive schemes for various sectors. As the name itself suggests, that the scheme would entail that if a sector increases its production, then it would get certain financial incentives. And lastly, with respect to government final consumption expenditure. So, after the second wave of the COVID, and as we have also discussed in our previous lectures, that the government's expenditure had seen a dip, which is why there was a dip in GDP growth in the first quarter of this very financial year. Therefore, the government can yet not take the back seat and reduce its spending. The government has to keep on spending more for quite some time so that the economy revives, because private sentiment with respect to consumption will take some time to rise up, and therefore action is needed on all the three fronts and not just on the front of private final consumption expenditure. That will be all for today. Should you have any doubts, feel free to put your doubts in the comment section. Also, as UPSC aspirants, we need to be able to differentiate between what is policy and what is political. As you know that by means of this lecture series, I try to cover up Indian Express's Explained section, Big Picture Debates of Rajya Sabha TV, and the Science Monitor by Rajya Sabha TV on a daily basis. However, there was no lecture on Tuesday because the articles that were published were of political nature and not policy nature, and that is a realm in which as aspirants we need not to delve in. Thank you and have a nice day.